who's doing the clap this time?
Go on, Joe. You need to practice.
Hold on.
Yeah, that's what we wanted.
I'm not ready. I don't ready.
Or do you want a bit of B-roll, mate? Here you go. On the right.
Hi, Mum. Yeah, keep that in.
Yeah.
Okay, give it.
That was the best clap I've ever seen. We'll have a clap off in a minute. All right. There you go. That's better. Give me a cuppage.
I've got the wrong shaped hand.
So, I've lost count of how many videos we've done now, but I think this is probably number 3. We're going to talk a little bit about participants in the supply chain or people you would buy stuff from. Because I think, from a procurement perspective, there's lots of different companies you probably will interact with as part of a security project. And so if we kick around some of the ideas around different layers of the supply chain, in my mind, the bottom of that sort of diagram that's in my head right now is the resellers.
Yeah.
So this is people who would take different security products and just sell them to you without doing much to them. I don't think there's that many of those left anymore because most people find there's a bit more profit in the actual configuring and installing and running things as a service. What's your view on that?
Well, they definitely still exist. There are fewer of them, as I think you've covered already. I suppose they capitalize on the complexity of the licensing, and there is actually a mini industry of people who will deeply understand how the various software licenses work to try and get you sort of best value for what you actually need, rather than the situation like the hi-fi analogy of getting talked into something you didn't actually need because you didn't understand it fully. You were able to be hoodwinked effectively. So yeah, I those people are still there. The thing that surprised me, and it's been a little while since I've been actually buying software because I've been working for vendors instead, but certainly going back to sort of 2017, 2018, there was a new dimension where these major vendors were trying to get you to take their cloud offering as opposed to buying the software yourself and installing it yourself, even if that was on a cloud-based server. They wanted to sell some sort of service, subscription, cloud native version. And being a bit cynical about these things, if you can remember that far back, and I know you'll say I'm not old enough, it's a bit like IBM in the 1990s, because there was this element of lock-in with how they sold, and you used to find an IBM shop and there was wall-to-wall IBM in lots of different areas, even networking, token ring networking, Lotus Notes for email rather than Microsoft, and so on and so on and so on, PCs, AS400, all of that old stuff. But now the cloud providers are pulling out this playbook and dusting it off. And so the really large enterprises that are engaging with cloud in a very mature way are trying to find ways to avoid this lock-in aspect and are trying to make it harder to deploy cloud native at a sort of architectural review level. So when a design for a system is put forward for approval, check that this is something that we can manage regardless of which cloud provider we might be on. Some of that is down to regulations.
You're getting bullied by the
flagged here, yeah. And you have regulations like the Monetary Authority in Singapore that says you have to have a cloud exit strategy. So the easiest way to have a cloud exit strategy is to deploy your production services across 2 clouds.
Yeah.
And that means you have to take more responsibility for what you're deploying. So you can't take the, say, the managed cluster from Amazon, and then on the other side, the managed cluster from Microsoft, and expect that all to hook up and work nicely. You might have to run your own Kubernetes cluster across both clouds, and maybe even on-premise as well. and you take more of the overall responsibility for that.
And so from a supply chain perspective, you need to find people who understand and advise on that sort of complexity and create the different models.
And the thing that fights getting the good advice, or at least at a sensible price, is really the notion of what a project is. So where a project is a temporary organization constructed to complete a task. A lot of IT personnel come in, do a project and leave again. You don't have the same continuity that you once had with certain key people who knew an awful lot about how the business operated and how all the various systems were interconnected. So a lot of the time it's new faces giving you the advice, and then the procurement person would be thinking, well, what's their angle? Why are they advising me to go this way or that way? What's in it for them? And it might be an extended contract, and it might be bringing more people that are allied with them or part of their consultancy, increase the footprint of their consultancy in the business. All of those things sort of come into play. But if they haven't retained the skills,
would you believe it?
well, yeah, but if they haven't retained the skills because they didn't want to pay to retain the skills, this is the crux of the problem, then you end up paying more when you urgently need to deliver something and you need to set up a project.
So in sort of different types of companies, and you've mentioned a few there. So we talked about the resellers and the fact they're just selling some product and that's all they do. And they're less and less common, but there are still people that exist. You've got the consultants, of which there are many, who are the experts in delivering certain things. And they can be quite expensive. And certainly in cyber and security generally, they command a premium because they've got specialist skills in them.
And they may well have done exams so that they have a certificate to prove that they know what they claim that they know. And then the procurement person who doesn't know them from Adam is looking for that kind of evidence, because like, how do I know I can trust this person? That kind of thing. And that feeds into lots of areas of security. There are more and more specialist security exams and certificates that people could get.
Do you know which ones are the big ones in terms of this? If you're a procurement person looking for certain things, what are the most common certificates?
One of the main ones from a security manager certification point of view is CISSP, which is described as being an inch deep and a mile wide. So it's designed to give somebody a very broad understanding of across all of security, so that you're able to make good decisions, really. So if you start with the assumption that you can't do all of the things that you would want to do, and you have to somehow prioritize and look at what's important, making the right decision becomes even more critical.
So picking a consultant, you want to look for the appropriate...
Can you just turn your mic? It's upside down.
I'm
just going to cut in there quickly. So
okay. Hold on. I'll turn it like that way.
there you go.
Okay.
Perfect.
Do you want to get a bit of B-roll over there while we're cut?
I was just going to crack on.
Okay.
They're properly dressed as well, unlike us.
Yeah.
I'm going to leave all the sun for...
We'll race you.
I think they'll win.
Yes, they probably would.
I don't think I'm going to cut. Let's just keep going from where we were.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, of course, yeah. No clap required. So from a procurement perspective, you would look to buy consultants with the right certifications in things like CISSP, and those sorts of accreditations are important. And that's both buying consultants, but also buying contingent labour and sort of specialist contractors.
Yeah.
Those sorts of things.
And it gets tricky because people are sometimes bewildered. There are too many certifications out there.
Yeah.
So you end up with this sort of Rolls-Royce job spec of what you need the consultant to have, attributes-wise, exams and so on. And that can be often a little unrealistic.
Yeah.
It often speaks to getting these things off the internet or asking OpenAI what to put in the job description. All those sorts of things. You've got to really understand your requirements. And it helps if the consultant, because I've been in this position, has a hand in specifying the important parts of the program. So if there's a program of work, you're able to get a consultant for a longer period of time. You will have some continuity through it. And you also have the ability to examine the priorities and also exactly what it is you're doing. Because in the beginning of a lot of these security programs, people may have specified what is being done in terms of tools they think are valuable to have, as opposed to looking at it from an architecture and capabilities standpoint.
Yeah.
If you look at it from a capability standpoint, you often find that far fewer tools can do a lot more, just because somebody is prioritizing, well, I like the dashboard that this particular tool gives me. That helps me in terms of the security operations center or reporting to my manager or whatever it might be.
So
all that has to be factored in.
So getting consultants involved in the start of the project, consultants involved potentially to do implementation, those sorts of things. That's all part of the implementation. You buy equipment, you implement it.
Yeah.
In terms of ongoing services, you've mentioned SOC a few times. There's a big industry around what they call managed security service managed services security partners, or I'm never going to drive it, MSSPs.
Yeah.
And again, what would their role typically be in delivery of security in an organization?
That is often to do with reaction time. If regulators or an auditor have been into a business and they've judged that the security is below par, and the board's been given a sort of, in no uncertain terms,
Fix it.
you need to improve maturity, and we'll be back in a year or two to check that you've done it. Often the business does not have the resources to run a security operations center, or they might have a couple of people offshore that can do this, but they may not have a full complement, or they may not have anyone who's a subject matter expert in running that kind of thing. So they might use a managed security provider to fulfill that, maybe for a year contract, and then with a view to getting off that and handing over to internal resources, but giving them more time to be in place or come up to speed or whatever it might be.
Or in some cases, if an organization isn't big enough to have their own security professionals,
Yeah.
buying a part of somebody else's managed service could be
Yeah.
sensible, but you just need to make sure that the commercials work correctly, so you're getting good value for money from a procurement perspective, but also, in that context, there's another one of those services where you need to think about service level agreements and what they're actually delivering and how they integrate the processes, how they integrate with the IT function and stuff like that. So it's a valid business model, but it's a more complex thing than just buying a piece of hardware or a
Yeah,
consultancy.
and if the SLA commitments are not met, just like a SaaS provider, you would hope to have formal service reviews, and there may be hosting credits or something like that offered if the SLA falls below expectations, that kind of stuff.
So you've got resellers, you've got consultants, you've got MSSPs. Are there any other sort of big types of companies outside of the vendors themselves? Are there any other sort of companies that you would typically run into as well?
I mean, the other two types to talk about is penetration testing and what's called red teaming. So penetration testing is basically running a series of tests on something just before it goes live in production, typically, and producing a report of any defects, which can hopefully then be addressed before something goes live with real users. It may be not just the people in your business, it may be your customers that are using the system and it's facing the internet invariably. It may be cloud hosted as well. So all of these are adding complexity.
So penetration testing is as it sounds. Someone's testing whether they can penetrate your defenses.
Trying to break in, yes.
Yeah. And that typically, how do you pay for that per test or on a number of days? You know how that's...
You may have a retainer for one of the larger penetration testing companies, but you would typically pay per test. Because it's quite a manual endeavor all the way through. What the usual criticism of penetration testing is that maybe 5, maybe 10% of all the production services will actually be deemed critical enough to be formally penetration tested. And then for the rest, you're looking at dynamic application security testing or web application scanning, that kind of thing, to look at what's on your perimeter, whether that's on-premise or in the cloud, and try to make sure as much as you can that that doesn't have vulnerabilities. Linked in with DAST is what's called attack surface management. So again, going back many years ago, what was exposed to the internet was a small proportion of the IT estate. It wasn't changing very rapidly. These days, there's a concept called attack surface management, which is recognizing that the perimeter is really fluid now, especially with all the various environments for various cloud services that may be being deployed. And you can no longer manage this in a spreadsheet. And so you need tools actively looking for anything which are owned by your business, which is using things like Whois records and things like that. And then feeding that into your vulnerability management testing and making sure that you're sweeping that whole perimeter.
Yeah.
And so that obviously feeds into buying and selling of companies as well. You've got to make sure that that ownership is transferred if you sell somebody.
So again, from a procurement perspective, understanding the scope and the breadth of what you're actually buying is really important, because if you don't fully understand the requirement, you'll end up buying something that doesn't have the complexity or manage the complexity that clearly some bigger organizations and probably some small organizations that have got critical services could require. So does that cover off the bulk of the sort of companies that procurement people would interface to when buying cyber? Do you think outside of
mainly, yes. Yeah.
Okay. So in the next segment, because I think Harry's desperate to get his drone out, not a euphemism, we will talk about vendors, the big vendors in terms of manufacturers of cyber equipment, and see where that takes us.